The wind carried a dry whistle across the open land, brushing over grass that had long turned brittle under the sun. It was the kind of morning that felt restless, as if the earth itself was waiting for something to happen. Out on the far edge of the ranch, where the fences leaned tiredly and the soil cracked in thin lines, a poor rancher pushed forward with slow steps, his boots sinking slightly into the dusty ground. He had woken long before dawn, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. The ranch had been failing for years, and every day felt like a reminder that life was pulling harder on him than he could pull back. Despite his struggles, he still moved with a sense of duty, checking the fence lines the same way he had since he was barely old enough to lift a hammer. The fences were old and stretched thin, just like the man who cared for them. He muttered under his breath as he tightened a loose wire, thinking about the rising cost of feed and the old barn roof that needed patching. Still, he stayed out there, doing what he could with what little he had. The land hadn't given him much lately, but it was the only life he knew. He kept walking along the boundary, scanning the line where wilderness kissed the edge of his property. Up ahead, he suddenly heard a sharp, panicked sound. It wasn't the cry of cattle or the bark of a stray dog. It was sharper, deeper, and filled with raw fear. He stopped where he stood, his heart thumping as the wind carried the sound once more. It was a wild horse, and it wasn't just calling out. It was suffering. The rancher hurried forward, his steps uneven as he crossed patches of uneven dirt and old roots. He ducked under a leaning fence post and made his way toward the noise until he finally saw it. A wild horse stood tangled in rusted fence wire near the tree line. Its chest heaved, and its eyes darted around in panic. The animal's coat was coated in dust, and the wire had tightened around one of its legs, cutting into the skin. The horse tried to pull away, but every desperate tug only tightened the snare. The rancher froze for a moment, not out of fear for himself, but out of concern for the creature. Wild horses didn't take kindly to humans getting too close, especially when trapped and hurting, yet leaving it there wasn't an option. He could never walk away from suffering, no matter how little he had or how hard life had been. He approached slowly, keeping his voice steady and low, calling softly the same way he had when working with nervous calves or gentle ranch horses. The horse snorted and jerked back, nearly falling, but exhaustion was already pulling at its weight. The rancher saw the way it trembled, the way its front legs wobbled, and he knew it had been fighting that wire for hours. Maybe all night. He knelt down just a few feet away and studied the mess of twisted metal digging into its leg. The wire wasn't just looped around the horse. It had tangled in a way that would require careful hands to undo. He reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out the small cutting pliers he always carried. He had repaired fences with those pliers for years, but this was the first time he would use them to save a wild animal. The horse watched him with wide, wary eyes, its breath quick and shaky. He kept his movements gentle and unhurried. Animals had a way of sensing a person's intentions, and he hoped the horse could feel he meant no harm. When he touched the first piece of wire, the horse flinched, but it didn't try to kick. It simply pulled back a little, enough to tighten the wire once more. The rancher felt the tension dig deeper and whispered a soft reassurance, even though he knew the horse couldn't understand the words. It was the tone that mattered. Bit by bit, he worked on the wire, snipping through each section and easing it away so he didn't worsen the injury. The wind rattled through the nearby branches, carrying leaves across the ground as the horse's breathing slowed. Finally, the last piece snapped free and the horse stumbled backward, nearly collapsing from relief. It stood with difficulty, one leg lifted slightly off the ground, trembling from the strain. The rancher backed away to give the animal space, knowing it needed to feel free. For a moment, neither moved. The rancher simply watched, waiting to see if the horse would flee into the trees like any other wild creature would. But the horse didn't run. Instead, it fixed its gaze on the rancher in a way that made the air feel heavier. There was something almost unsettling about the stillness in its eyes. Not fear, not panic, not the usual wild unpredictability. It was something deeper, something the rancher couldn't quite place. He took another step back, unsure if the horse was too exhausted to leave or if something was keeping it rooted there. He had seen wild horses his entire life. He had watched them running across the hills, kicking up dust in long, graceful lines, their heads high and their spirits untamed. But he had never seen one look at a human like this. There was a strange calm in the creature's expression, almost as if it was studying him. The rancher felt it more than he understood it, a quiet pull in the air, a feeling that this moment wasn't ending the way he expected. He cleared his throat and took another slow step back. The horse shifted its weight, testing its newly freed leg. It wasn't fully steady, but the pressure was gone. The rancher expected it to turn toward the forest at any second. That's what wild animals did. They took the freedom they were given and disappeared into the land without a trace. But instead of leaving, the horse took a small step toward the rancher. The rancher's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move. The horse came closer, slow and cautious, as if trying to decide whether he was friend or foe. Dust clung to its mane and its sides, and its injured leg shook with each shift of weight. Yet there was a quiet determination in its movement that unsettled the rancher more than any wild reaction ever had. For a creature that had spent its life avoiding humans, this behavior made no sense. He spoke softly again, telling the horse to rest, to go back to the open land where it belonged. His voice wavered despite his attempt to stay calm. Something about the horse's steady gaze made him feel as if this encounter was no ordinary moment. He wondered if the horse was too hurt to walk away or if it simply didn't realize it was free now. But the longer the creature stood there, the more the rancher felt something else rising in the air, something he couldn't describe. The forest behind them rustled lightly, the wind brushing through tall grass. The land felt strangely still, as if watching the two of them. The rancher shifted uneasily. He had planned to finish checking the fence, maybe gather a few fallen branches before heading back home. But now he couldn't take his eyes off the horse, and the horse couldn't seem to look anywhere but at him. Just as he took another step back, the horse lifted its head sharply, ears turning toward a sound the rancher hadn't heard yet. A faint noise came from deeper in the trees, something muted but present enough to change the animal's posture. The rancher's heartbeat sped up for reasons he couldn't explain. The horse's injured leg trembled, but it remained alert, completely focused on something beyond the rancher's view. Whatever the horse sensed, it wasn't ordinary. The rancher felt it in his chest, a quiet warning he didn't understand. The wild horse he had just freed stood between him and the trees as if preparing for something. And the rancher, staring into those deep, steady eyes, felt the first sharp tug of fear mixed with curiosity. Whatever was coming wasn't part of a normal day. And the horse, despite its injury, wasn't about to leave him alone. The rancher kept standing there, unsure whether he should move or stay perfectly still. The horse's ears twitched again toward the trees, and something about the way it held itself made the rancher's stomach tighten. He had seen wild animals react to danger before, but this was different. The horse wasn't frightened the way a trapped creature usually was. It seemed alert and aware, almost like it was preparing to respond to whatever sound had reached it. The rancher slowly turned his head toward the forest, squinting to see through the shadows. There was nothing visible, nothing moving, but the air held a strange tension that pushed against his nerves. He took a small step back toward the fence, not wanting to startle the horse, but also not wanting to be standing unprepared if something unexpected came out of those trees. The horse shifted again, still watching the tree line, and the rancher noticed how carefully it balanced its weight on the injured leg. The cut from the wire was raw, and dried blood clung to its coat. It needed rest, maybe even care, though he wasn't sure how close it would let him get again. He had never tried to treat a wild horse, and he wasn't sure how wise it would be to even attempt it. Still, he couldn't ignore the strange bond that seemed to hold the animal there with him. Wild horses simply didn't behave this way. They ran from people even when rescued. They took their chance at freedom as soon as they could. Yet this one stood close, as if it had a reason not to leave. The rancher rubbed the back of his neck, trying to make sense of the uneasiness settling in his chest. He had lived long enough to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him something was off. He cleared his throat and spoke softly, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't know why he felt the need to talk to the horse, but somehow it felt right. He said he needed to head back, that he had to get some rope and maybe some feed. The horse flicked its tail once, its gaze still fixed on the woods, and the rancher realized it wasn't ready to move. The tension in the air didn't lift. It only deepened. He knew he couldn't stand there forever. The ranch chores wouldn't wait for him, and his failing fence sure wasn't going to fix itself. Still, leaving the injured horse alone didn't sit well with him. He took a slow step backward, then another. The horse finally shifted its head in his direction, almost as if checking to see whether he was leaving for good. The rancher hesitated, studying the animal's expression. There was trust in its eyes, or at least something close to it, something he didn't expect to find in a creature that had lived free its whole life. After a few seconds, he turned and began walking toward the fence. He didn't take his eyes off the horse until he reached the boundary. When he climbed over the old boards, they groaned under his weight, and he made a mental note to repair them soon. As he moved away, he kept glancing back every few steps. The horse didn't follow, but it also didn't leave. It stayed right where it was, near the trees, watching him as though waiting for something. Back at the ranch house, he went straight to the small shed where he kept his tools. He gathered some soft rope, a small sack of oats, and a cloth that he hoped would help him clean the horse's leg. While filling a bucket with water, he kept thinking about the horse's reaction. The sound from the trees still echoed faintly in his mind. He wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else entirely, but whatever it had been, it had unsettled both of them. The ranch house felt quiet as he prepared the supplies. Too quiet? He had grown used to the silence that came with living alone, but this quiet felt heavier. It carried the weight of worry, mystery, and the strange sense that the morning had shifted something in his life. He didn't know if the horse would still be there when he returned, but every part of him hoped it would be. The land had been unforgiving to him for years, taking more from him than it gave. The idea of helping a wild creature, of forming some kind of connection, brought a small spark of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. After gathering everything, he headed back through the fields. The sky was brighter now, the sun pushing away the thin fog that had lingered earlier. Birds called from the trees, and the wind brushed the tall grass in long waves. But as he neared the fence line, a nervous feeling crept back into him. He scanned the open area ahead, hoping the horse hadn't wandered off. He let out a slow breath when he spotted it. The horse was still standing in the same place, though it looked more restless now. Its ears twitched constantly, and it shifted its stance as if unsure whether to flee or stay. The rancher climbed back over the fence and walked toward it, keeping his pace steady. As he got closer, the horse lowered its head slightly, watching him with the same cautious trust as before. He set the bucket down and slowly opened the bag of oats. The horse's nostrils flared as the scent reached it, and it took a hesitant step forward. The rancher smiled a little. Even the proudest animals had a weakness for good feed. He placed a small handful on the ground in front of him and backed away. The horse waited a moment before leaning down to sniff the oats, then began eating with small, careful bites. While it ate, the rancher knelt near the injured leg, but kept enough distance to avoid surprising the animal. He studied the wound again. It wasn't as deep as he first feared, but it would need time to heal. He soaked the cloth in the water and spoke softly before reaching toward the leg. The horse tensed, but it didn't pull away. With slow, deliberate movements, he dabbed at the dried blood, cleaning away the dirt and dust. Each touch made the horse flinch slightly, but it stayed put, trusting him more than he expected. As he worked, he kept thinking about the strange sound from the trees. It hadn't been a predator. He would have recognized that. It was something else, something he still couldn't explain. The horse had reacted as though it knew what the sound meant, and that thought bothered him. Animals sense things humans couldn't. Storms, danger, changes in the land. Maybe there was something out there that neither of them fully understood yet. When he finished cleaning the wound, he stood slowly and stepped back. The horse lifted its head and looked at him again, its expression unreadable but calm. He offered another handful of oats, and this time the horse stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of its breath. It was a moment he didn't want to break, a tiny piece of peace in a life that hadn't known much of it. But the peace didn't last. A sharp crack echoed from the distance, like a branch snapping under weight. The horse's head shot up, its ears pointing toward the forest once again. The rancher's heart jumped. That sound was much clearer than before. He turned toward the trees, scanning the shadows, but all he saw was shifting light and leaves moving in the wind. The horse took a step toward him, not away from him, as if seeking reassurance. That reaction alone sent a strange chill down his spine. Something was out there. Something the horse wanted to keep him close from. The rancher felt torn between going to investigate or leading the horse farther from the trees. But before he could decide, another soft noise drifted out from the woods, this time slower, heavier, almost like a footstep. He swallowed hard and kept his eyes fixed on the trees. He didn't want to imagine someone or something watching from the shadows, but the feeling was impossible to ignore. The horse's breath grew louder, its muscles tensing despite its injury. The rancher realized then that whatever had kept the horse from leaving earlier hadn't been fear of its injury. It had been fear of what waited beyond the trees. And now, standing out in the open with nothing but a bucket and a bag of oats, he felt the first sharp pull of real danger tightening around the quiet morning. The cold wind carried a low whistle across the open stretch of land as he reined in his breath and tried to clear his head. The wild horse had run off into the rising dawn with that strange mix of fear and purpose, leaving him with a knot of questions he couldn't tie or untie. He had freed animals before, mended fences more times than he could count, and spent seasons watching creatures fight for life out on the prairie, but he had never seen anything like the look that horse gave him before bolting away. There had been something sharp in its eyes, almost as if it wanted to speak, but it wasn't fear or gratitude alone. It was something deeper, something unsettling. He walked slowly back toward the barn, dragging his boots through the dust that had turned loose and dry from weeks without rain. The wood creaked under his hand as he pulled the door open. The light inside felt darker than usual. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. He kept hearing the sound of the wire pulling tight against the horse's leg, kept seeing the twisting of the fence he had hammered straight only 2 days earlier. It didn't make sense. That stretch of fence didn't loosen on its own. Something had done that, and he needed to find out what. The cattle had begun stirring, low grunts filling the stillness of morning. He tossed feed into the trough and tried to focus, but his thoughts kept circling back to the tracks he had seen near the fence. They were wide and oddly spaced. At first he had dismissed them as marks from a wandering mare, but the more he pictured them, the more wrong they seemed. They had been too deep for a single horse, too scattered to belong to cattle. It bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. He saddled his old gelding and headed toward the backfields, following the line of the fence where he had first spotted the wild horse. The sky had turned pale gold, enough to cast shadows long across the dirt. Every sound felt sharper than usual, as if the land itself had begun paying attention. He rode slowly, leaning forward, scanning the ground. The horse beneath him snorted and shifted, uneasy for no clear reason. When he reached the place where the wild horse had been trapped, he dismounted and crouched low. The wire still showed fresh bends, curled and torn. He ran his fingers over the metal, trying to imagine what had happened. The tracks were still there too, faint but readable. He followed them a few steps and felt his heartbeat pick up again. The soil told a story, but it wasn't one he understood. The tracks didn't move in a straight line. They circled and crossed, like whatever made them had been pacing or searching for something. He stood up, brushing dirt from his hands, and looked out across the valley. A single horse wouldn't move like that. Something had spooked it or kept it waiting. But waiting for what? He turned, ready to ride back, when a new mark caught his eye. It was faint, half covered by loose dust, but its shape was unusual. A narrow dragline cut over the other prints, like something had been pulled or pushed. He followed it a few yards before losing it near the old creek bed. Nothing made sense. A wild horse trapped in wire wasn't strange on its own, but all this felt off in a way he couldn't shake. Back at the ranch house, he set his hat on the table and ran a hand through his hair. The place felt too quiet. The walls seemed to hold the echo of the morning's events. He poured a cup of coffee, hoping the warmth would settle him, but the first sip barely touched the tightness in his chest. The wild horse had not just run from danger. It had run with purpose, like it knew exactly where it needed to go. He stepped outside and leaned against the porch rail, scanning the open land. Stories of strange happenings traveled fast in small towns, and he had heard enough over the years to fill a book, but he had never cared much for stories. He believed what he could see and what he could fix. But this situation felt like something was studying him as much as he was studying it. The day stretched on with a restless edge. He repaired a hinge on the barn door, checked the feed storage, and made a run to the far well. But his thoughts were never far from that wild horse and the strange tracks. Every so often, he would stop and look toward the ridge, half expecting the horse to appear again. In the late afternoon, clouds gathered low, thick, and heavy. The scent of coming rain drifted through the air. He decided to check the fence again before dark, even though he had already gone over it twice. He saddled his horse and rode out. The breeze had picked up, rattling dry grass against the posts. The land looked different under the dimming light, as if new shapes hid in the shadows. When he reached the far end of the fence, he found something he hadn't noticed earlier. A broken piece of rope lay tangled in a clump of sagebrush. It wasn't his rope, and it wasn't the kind used by nearby ranchers. The weave was tighter and darker. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It looked like part of a halter, but rougher, almost handmade. He felt a slow rise of unease. Someone had been out here, and not by accident. He walked the fence line again, this time searching for any sign of human tracks. The dry soil made it difficult, but near the corner post, he found what he feared. A partial boot print, faint but there, not his. He stared at it for a long moment, wondering if someone had been trying to catch the wild horse or chase it. If that was the case, then the horse's frantic state made more sense. But why would someone chase a wild horse across these parts? Most folks left the Mustangs alone unless they were rounding one up for training. And even then, no one used rope like the one he now held. He rode back slowly, scanning the land again, noticing every shift of the wind and every distant sound as if danger might rise from the ground itself. His horse twitched its ears, uneasy. The clouds finally broke, letting out a thin curtain of rain that made the world look blurred and unfinished. He felt the damp settle into his jacket, but he didn't speed up. Something told him to stay alert. At the ranch gate, he stopped and listened. The cattle were quiet, too quiet. Normally the herd would stir when he returned, but the field felt still. He opened the gate and stepped inside, glancing toward the barn. A shadow moved near the edge of the doorway. He tensed, gripping the reins until his knuckles tightened. When he approached, the shadow slipped out of sight. He swung down from his saddle and walked forward. The barn door creaked in the wind. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Everything looked normal at first glance. The tools hung in place. The feed buckets were lined against the wall, but the air felt wrong, like someone had been there recently. His eyes moved over the barn until they stopped at the far stall. A single piece of straw lay bent in a direction that didn't match the rest, and the dust beside the wall had been disturbed. Someone had leaned there, watched something. Maybe watched him. He stood still, listening. The rain tapped lightly on the roof, steady and soft. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Whoever had been there was gone now, but they had been close enough to study his routines, close enough to step inside his barn without hesitation. When he turned to leave, he felt the weight of the rope fragment still in his pocket. The wild horse, the tracks, the broken rope, the boot print, the shadow in the barn. None of it added up in a way he liked. And somewhere out there, the wild horse was running with purpose, running from something or running toward something. Either way, he had a feeling the animal held a piece of the truth he needed. As he walked back to the house, the thunder rolled low across the valley, not loud enough to shake the earth, but enough to settle a warning deep in his bones. The night ahead would not be quiet, and whatever had started with that wild horse was far from finished. The night settled heavy over the ranch, darker than usual and quieter in a way that felt unnatural. The rain had stopped, but a thick mist clung to the ground, rolling low and ghost-like across the open field. He stood on the porch for a long moment before stepping off, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. His thoughts kept returning to that wild horse and the strange rope and the quiet shape that had slipped away in the barn. Nothing felt random anymore. He walked toward the fence line again, drawn by a feeling he couldn't shake. The air smelled of wet earth and distant pine. The moon hid behind a layer of clouds, casting the world in a dim glow that made every shape look unfamiliar. His boots sank slightly into damp soil as he moved further from the house. He kept scanning the horizon, the fields, the dark patches of brush, always expecting something to shift or stir. The wild horse had come from the western ridge. That much he remembered clearly. And if someone had chased it, then whoever they were might still be up there, waiting for a chance to finish what they started. He didn't like the thought of someone crossing his land, hiding in the shadows, watching from a distance. The idea felt colder than the night air brushing across his skin. He saddled his horse again and rode slowly toward the ridge, letting the animal pick its pace. The gelding moved cautiously, ears flicking left and right, muscles tense beneath the worn leather saddle. Every small sound made the horse swallow and shift. A branch cracked somewhere in the distance, and he tightened his grip on the reins, scanning the darkness. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but he knew he could no longer ignore what was happening. The ride took longer than usual because he kept stopping to listen, trying to pick apart the normal sounds of nighttime from the ones that didn't belong. The further he traveled, the more the mist thickened. The ground near the ridge turned rocky, and he dismounted, choosing to walk the rest of the way. As he stepped onto the higher ground, he saw something he hadn't expected. Down in the shallow dip below the ridge, faint tracks marked the damp soil, fresh ones. Hoofprints mixed with deeper indentations from boots. He crouched, running his hand along the edges of the tracks. The bootprints pointed toward the deeper trees, as if someone had moved through there not long before. His pulse quickened. He followed the tracks, careful not to make much noise. The trees grew dense, their branches weaving together overhead like a tangled net. The wind murmured through them, soft and steady. He kept his steps light, each one deliberate. Halfway through the trees, he stopped suddenly. A broken twig lay at his feet, freshly snapped. Beyond it, he heard something. Not loud, but unmistakable. Breathing, human breathing, controlled but uneven. Someone was out there in the trees, close enough to hear him if he spoke. He crouched behind a fallen log and waited. The breathing continued, slow but strained. A horse snorted softly in the distance. Not his horse, not a ranch horse. The sound was lighter, quicker, the wild horse. He felt the pull of tension rise through him. If the wild horse was here, then whoever had chased it must be near it too. He stayed low and edged forward until he could see through the branches. What he saw made his stomach twist with a mix of fear and urgency. The wild horse stood near a narrow clearing, sides heaving, head lifted high with alertness. Its coat glistened faintly in the moonlight. A rope hung loosely around its neck, not tight enough to trap it, but close enough to show someone had managed to get hold of it again. A figure moved near the horse. A man, maybe, though he couldn't see the face clearly. The stranger held the end of the rope, but instead of pulling, he seemed to be studying the animal the way someone studies something they want but cannot control. The stranger's shoulders were hunched slightly forward, posture sharp with impatience. The rancher's breath drew in tight. This was the person who had stepped onto his land, the one who had slipped into the barn, the one the horse had been fleeing. Whoever he wasn't just passing through. He needed to get closer. He inched to the right, using the thick trees as cover. Every movement felt heavier than the last. The wild horse stamped its hoof, tossing its head, sensing something in the air. The stranger murmured something low, too quiet to understand, but the tone carried an edge of frustration. The horse didn't respond the way he wanted. The rancher moved one step too quickly, and a rock shifted beneath his boot. The sound was small, but in that stillness it carried. The stranger whipped his head around. The rancher froze, keeping low. For a moment, the woods fell into absolute silence. Then the stranger turned fully, staring into the dark. The rancher couldn't see the man's eyes, but he felt the weight of that stare searching through the shadows. The wild horse jerked back at the movement, snapping the stranger's attention and almost breaking free from the rope. The man tightened his grip just in time, muttering under his breath with irritation. The rancher eased back into the deeper shadows, waiting until the man's attention moved again. He was trying to figure out how to approach without startling the horse or alerting the stranger too early. The wind shifted and carried a faint scent toward him, smoke, not thick like a fire, but faint enough to suggest someone had camped nearby. Whoever this stranger was, he had been around longer than a night, maybe days, maybe longer than that. He needed answers, and he needed to find out why the wild horse mattered so much to this man. He edged closer, stepping quietly until he had a clearer view. The man tugged the rope lightly, trying to coax the wild horse forward, but the animal resisted, holding its ground with fierce determination. The rancher noticed something else then. A faint mark on the horse's side, almost hidden beneath its damp coat. Not a wound, but something shaped and deliberate. Almost like a symbol. He squinted, trying to make sense of it in the dim light. The stranger suddenly turned, sensing something again. The rancher eased behind a tree, but this time the man walked a few steps toward him. His boots pressed into the damp soil with slow, deliberate intent. The rancher's heartbeat thudded hard in his chest, not from fear, but from the tension of not knowing what would happen next. The stranger stopped just a few yards away, scanning the trees with a steady hand resting near his belt, as if he expected company. The rancher couldn't see what he carried, but the posture alone was enough to keep him alert. The man muttered something again, more clearly this time. It wasn't any phrase the rancher recognized, but it carried the tone of someone impatient and determined. After a long moment, the stranger walked back toward the horse, tugging the rope again. The rancher felt the urgency pushing inside him. He couldn't wait much longer. If that man took the horse deeper into the woods, the chance to understand this whole uneasy puzzle would slip away. He took a breath and stepped out from behind the tree. The stranger spun at the sound, eyes narrowing, posture shifting sharply. The wild horse reared halfway, startled by both movement and tension. The rancher kept his hands low, palms open, trying not to startle either of them further. The stranger stared at him, silent and unreadable. The rope trembled in his hand as the horse pulled back again. The rancher finally spoke, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. He didn't shout or demand answers. He simply stated that the land belonged to him and that he had questions. The stranger didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his stance, angling himself between the rancher and the horse, as if protecting it or claiming it. The horse snorted, hooves scraping against the earth. A gust of wind tore through the clearing, rustling everything at once. The trees swayed, the mist rippled, and the horse jerked hard enough to nearly pull the rope from the stranger's grip. The man snapped his attention back to the animal, swearing under his breath. The rancher used that moment to step closer. The tension thickened around them, almost humming in the air. The stranger's grip tightened. The horse's breathing grew louder. The rancher reached for the rope, not to take it, but to steady the situation. For a heartbeat, everything held still. The stranger, the horse, the rancher. Then the wild horse lunged backward with a force that snapped the rope loose from the man's grip. The stranger stumbled forward. The horse bolted into the darkness. The rancher stepped back as the man turned sharply toward him again, eyes burning with a frustration that ran deeper than anger. The tension surged higher than ever, rising toward a moment that would push everything toward the edge of the story's climax. And now, with the horse gone and the stranger facing him in the middle of the mist-covered woods, the rancher knew that whatever came next would shake loose the truth he had been chasing all this time. The rancher stood still in the misty clearing, facing the stranger whose breath came sharp and uneven. The wild horse had vanished into the darkness, but instead of relief, a deeper question hung in the air. The stranger's eyes held something complicated, not just anger. There was fear, determination, and a weariness that did not fit the rough, tense posture he showed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The woods felt tight around them, like the branches themselves were leaning in to listen. The rancher broke the silence first, keeping his voice steady and calm. He wanted answers, but he didn't want the situation to break into something reckless. He asked the stranger what he wanted with the horse, why he had stepped onto land that wasn't his, and why he had been following the animal so relentlessly. The stranger didn't answer right away. He looked off toward the direction the horse had fled, as if calculating whether he should chase after it again, or whether this was the moment to say something he had avoided for far too long. Finally, the stranger let out a slow breath. He lowered his hand from where it hovered near his belt, not in surrender, but in a quiet sign that he was ready to talk. His voice was rough when he spoke, but not harsh. He explained that the wild horse wasn't just any stray animal. He said the horse meant something from his past, something he had been trying to make right. He wasn't looking to harm it. He had been trying to capture it because it had once belonged to his family, long before life had taken an unexpected turn and scattered everything they had built. The rancher listened carefully. The tension in his chest softened enough that he could breathe without the tightness pressing down. He asked the stranger to keep talking. The man shifted on his feet as if unsure how much to share, but something about the quiet patience in the rancher's expression pushed him forward. He explained that the horse had gotten loose months ago during a storm. He had looked for it everywhere, moving from place to place, chasing only hints and sightings. He had lost almost everything during that time, spending his days tracking the animal while trying to hold on to whatever hope he had left. When he finally caught sight of the horse near the ridge earlier that week, he followed it, determined not to lose it again. The rancher considered all of this. He knew what it felt like to hold on to something when life offered very little. He also remembered how the horse had panicked when tangled in the fence wire, as if it had not been handled in a long time. Whatever the stranger had been through, the horse had suffered too. He thought about how the wild horse had run toward his ranch for safety earlier. Maybe it sensed something he couldn't yet fully understand. He told the stranger that he believed him, but the situation needed a calmer approach. The horse was frightened and confused, and no amount of chasing would change that. If they wanted to do right by the animal, they needed trust, not force. The stranger looked at him with surprise, but after a moment, he nodded. He knew the rancher was right. He had been pushing too hard, letting desperation guide him instead of patience. Both men agreed to search for the wild horse together. They walked back toward the open field, the mist thinning as they left the deeper woods behind. The rancher's horse waited near the ridge, ears alert and steady. The stranger glanced at the gelding, then at the rancher, noticing the gentleness in the way he handled the reins. He realized the rancher wasn't just someone who worked the land. He was someone who understood animals deeply, someone who cared for them in a way not everyone could. They started tracking the wild horse's prints in the damp soil. The moon peeked out from behind the clouds, offering more light. The prints led toward a small clearing, not far from the stream that cut across the lower part of the ranch. They moved slowly, not wanting to rush into the area and scare the horse away. The rancher signaled for the stranger to stay behind him as they approached. There, near the water, the wild horse stood trembling but unharmed. It drank cautiously, ears flicking back every few seconds. The rancher motioned for the stranger to stay quiet. They moved inch by inch, careful not to alarm the animal. When the horse finally noticed them, it raised its head, muscles tensing as if ready to flee again. But this time, the rancher stepped forward calmly and knelt down, lowering his gaze in a gentle gesture. He spoke softly to the animal, using the same steady tone he used with injured ranch horses. The wild horse took slow breaths, shifting its weight, uncertain but not panicking. The stranger watched in silence. He saw something he had not expected. The horse seemed to recognize the rancher's calm presence. It eased slightly, taking a cautious step forward. The rancher remained still, letting the animal choose the pace. After a long moment, the horse stepped close enough that the rancher could touch its shoulder. The animal flinched at first, but then relaxed. The stranger stepped closer only when the rancher nodded. The wild horse turned its head toward him, nostrils flaring softly. The man reached out with a trembling hand. When his fingers finally brushed the horse's neck, emotion passed across his face in a way he didn't try to hide. The horse didn't pull away. It simply stood there, breathing slow and deep. The connection, strained for months, settled back into something familiar and peaceful. The rancher looked at both of them and felt a quiet warmth rise inside. The tension that had built for so long began to melt away. The stranger thanked him with a voice that shook slightly, not from fear, but from gratitude that had been held back for too long. The rancher nodded, saying he had done only what anyone should do for an animal in need. But the stranger knew better. Not everyone would have stepped in the way this man had. They walked back toward the ranch together, the wild horse following with calm steps. As they approached the barn, the rancher's gelding whinnied softly. The wild horse responded with a gentle sound, settling its nerves even more. The stranger looked around the ranch yard. taking in the worn fences, the old barn doors, the quiet strength of the place. He said the ranch was good land cared for with honest effort. The rancher accepted the compliment with a small smile. By morning the mist had lifted, revealing a bright blue sky. The stranger stood beside the wild horse, stroking its mane with slow movements. He told the rancher he planned to stay near the area for a while, not to intrude but to rebuild what he had lost and give the horse a stable home again. The rancher supported the idea, offering help if needed, though he knew the stranger would want to do most of it on his own. Before leaving, the stranger shook the rancher's hand. It wasn't just gratitude in the gesture. It was respect, the kind that forms only when people survive something tense together and come out stronger. The rancher watched him lead the horse toward the trail for a small walk, letting the bond settle naturally. The ranch felt calmer than it had in days. The birds drifted across the open sky, the breeze carried the scent of fresh grass, and the land seemed to breathe with relief. The rancher stood on the porch as sunlight warmed the fields. He thought about how life sometimes sent storms that tested people in ways they didn't expect. But storms passed, and what remained was what mattered: kindness, trust, quiet courage. The willingness to help something or someone lost find their way again. He felt grateful for what had unfolded. The wild horse was safe. The stranger had found a way forward. And the ranch, with all its worn edges and steady heart, felt more alive than ever. It reminded him that even in rough times, unexpected moments brought light. Sometimes, saving a frightened animal did more than fix a single problem. It connected lives, healed old wounds, and carried hope farther than anyone expected. As the sun rose higher, the rancher stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn, ready to begin a new day with a lighter heart. The land stretched wide and peaceful before him, promising better days ahead, and he was ready to meet them with the steady strength that had always guided him. The story that began with a wild horse trapped in fence wire had come full circle, ending not in fear, but in understanding, trust, and a renewed sense of hope that would stay with him for a long time.